Okay, now on to women and health. In this section, we will be focusing on the idea of psychiatry and psychology and women, and looking at the work of Phyllis Chester, a feminist sociologist who was also a psychiatrist, one of the few women in the profession at that time. Her work is seminal and, if you like, helps to implement some of the conceptual or models that we were looking at before. As a feminist sociologist writer, I think it's useful to recap and talk about some of the fundamentals we have looked at elsewhere. We looked at structural as opposed to agency approaches to sociology. Now, feminism, although not strictly speaking a structural approach, in the concept of patriarchy is. And let me make some links for you. We spoke, if you recall, about, in functionalism, the idea of value consensus. And we spoke also in terms of Marxism, in terms of ideology. And we looked at the relationship between these two concepts from the very different approaches. The basis of it is the idea that there is, if you like, a culture, one culture, a universal culture that is across our society. And that culture is made up of norms, expected patterns of behavior, values, what a society finds worthwhile, things like status, role, if you like, also rituals and ceremonies that make up the British way of life, our culture. Now, functionalists see the function of culture, or the function of a value consensus, the agreement of the key or core values in our society, as essential for the smooth running of society, and sees social institutions such as the family, education, the mass media, etc., as vital in pumping around this lifeblood, if you like, of culture, this unifying, forming lifeblood. Because if we didn't have this shared culture, shared values, society would fall apart through conflict. Marxism sees culture or ideology, or capitalist ideology, in a similar but radically different way. They see, again, they take a macro approach. They see a one culture kind of fitting all of us, and like functionalists, sees culture as a restrainer of action. However, unlike functionalists, they see this as not for the benefit of all of us, but for the benefit of a few, those that own the means of production, those rich opposed to those poor. And through social institutions, the justification, if you like, of the unjustifiable, the inequality inherent in a capitalist society is pumped round. So we understand in schools that the message is, if you work hard, you've got intelligence, you'll get good grades and a good job, and that if we all did this, this is a meritocratic society. And they point out that this is a lie, and it's simply for the benefit of the rich that these messages are sent out, because the people who benefit are not those working and competing with one another, but those at the top. Patriarchy is a very similar, but again, very distinctly different concept. It too describes culture. Unlike Marxism, it doesn't say it's for the benefit of the rich, but it says it's for the benefit of men. It describes how our culture functions in a way to subjugate women. I think we've mentioned in the past how it is in our very language. If you think of the origins of words like Mr. and Mrs., they come from the idea of owner and chattel, master and servant, master and mistress. Yes? Okay, so it's encoded in the very language in this way. And what feminists such as Chester argue is this subjugation, this restraining, this hemming in of and restraining of the action of women is part of a patriarchal structure. That makes sense. So patriarchy is key to understanding how Phyllis Chester approaches the idea of psychiatry and psychology, and how these professions work, because they are part of this patriarchal structure. They are like family, education, the government, religion and economics, spreading a message about women which defines them in a certain way and then characterizes and keeps them in that role. If you like, the feminine norm, which is one where the domestic goddess from the 50s is as good as enough bottle of this. The idea of what a woman should be: domestic, submissive, non-aggressive, and so on. And in fact, what Phyllis Chester suggests is that there is a healthy norm imposed upon women by society. So what is judged as healthy mental health for women is on the basis of this norm, and they're judged as healthy if they show the characteristics of the model imposed upon them by the idea of a male society, and they're characterized as neurotic or unhealthy or unhinged if they don't meet that norm, and they are therefore prescribed drugs and therapy accordingly. The work of psychologists and psychiatrists is to reinforce, to keep, to judge women by these norms and standards, and give appropriate therapies or medicines to correct women who stray from the patriarchal norm. The vast majority of therapists, workers, and in fact you could say the healthcare system itself reflects a patriarchal society, where the bulk of those who will be giving advice, offering medicine, giving psychiatric are men. It's a male-dominated profession in terms of, obviously not nurses, but the doctors, etc. One only needs to think of the male dominance of specialisms such as gynecology to see that there is a kind of male stream or mainstream male dominance here. Phyllis Chester also points out that it is part of the female norm, if you like, the female characteristics, that they are to ask for help, to help seekers, she describes them as, and in this way that they are put forward for judgment and correction to a kind of male judge, corrective figure who will put them right by the ideas of a male patriarchal society. As the quote here says, let's see if I can get my head out of the way. Since modern psychology is not only masculine, derived from our neurotic type of man, a great deal of its terminology originated from misinterpretation of women's terms in terms of women, in terms of man's sexual ideology. So in other words, if I can put it another way, and indeed this echoes exactly what Phyllis Chester was saying, that the role of both psychology and psychiatry is to make a woman up. That is to give her a makeover, to bring her to be more like what the male idea or the patriarchal, invisible patriarchal assumptions of our society imposes on women, that forces them to these ideals of beauty, behavior, etc., etc., etc. And in fact, what Phyllis Chester went on to suggest is that those that break or are indeed going against these patriarchal conditioning and these patriarchal reinforcement. So if you like, the mad women are in fact the revolutionaries, those that are throwing the stones against the system, those that are rising up and saying no more to patriarchy, and that they, instead of being institutionalized or dealt with in different ways, they should be celebrated and listened to.